The morning mist rolled across the whispering river like a mother's gentle breath, touching every stone and reed along its banks. In the small town of Millbrook, West Virginia, tucked deep in the Appalachian Valley, the river wasn't just water flowing between mountains. It was the heartbeat of a community that had existed for 5 generations. 7-year-old Lily Mae Thompson sat on the weathered dock behind her grandmother's house, her bare feet dangling in the cool water, watching the sunrise paint the surface gold. Her eyes, the color of storm clouds gathering, held a wisdom beyond her years, a quiet understanding of things most adults had forgotten. Every morning before school, she came here to talk to the river, sharing secrets that only moving water could keep safe. "Morning, river," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle current. "Grandma says there's men coming from the city again today. They got papers and machines. She's been crying when she thinks I'm not looking." The river gurgled in response, swirling around her ankles with what felt like reassurance. Lily had been born premature in the county hospital, fighting for every breath, and her grandmother always said it was the river water they blessed her with that gave her the strength to survive. Whether that was true or just one of Grandma Ruth's stories didn't matter to Lily. The river had been her companion through lonely afternoons when other kids played too rough, her comfort when her parents died in that car accident 3 years ago, leaving her in the care of a grandmother whose own bones creaked like old floorboards. The town of Millbrook had seen better days. The coal mines had closed 20 years ago, taking most of the jobs with them. Now, 347 souls remained, held together by stubbornness, tradition, and the river that provided fish, irrigation for the small farms, and a sense of continuity in an ever-changing world. The old-timers gathered at Murphy's General Store every morning, drinking coffee black as coal dust, talking about the weather, their grandchildren, and lately, about the men in suits who kept appearing with surveying equipment. Tom Murphy, the store owner whose grandfather had built the place in 1923, had overheard them talking at the diner. A hydroelectric dam project. Big money, big changes. The kind of progress that usually meant small towns like theirs became memories at the bottom of man-made lakes. That evening, Lily's grandmother stood at the town meeting in the small Baptist church, her weathered hands gripping the back of the pew in front of her. "This river raised our children," Ruth Thompson said, her voice carrying the authority of her 73 years. "It fed us through the Depression, gave us water during the droughts, and carried away our sorrows when the floods came. You can't put a price on that." The room murmured agreement, but everyone knew the truth that hung unspoken in the air. They were David facing Goliath, and this time, there might not be a miracle. The Apex Energy Corporation had already bought most of the land upstream through shell companies, leaving the town surrounded. Mayor Jim Henderson, a good man who'd spent his whole life in Millbrook, had been on the phone all week with lawyers, senators, anyone who might listen. But money talked louder than heritage, and Apex had plenty of it. As Ruth walked home with Lily after the meeting, the little girl held her grandmother's calloused hand tightly. "Grandma, can they really take the river away?" Ruth stopped, looking down at her granddaughter's upturned face in the yellow glow of the streetlight. "They can try, sweet pea. They can surely try." But in her heart, Ruth knew the truth. She'd seen it before in other valleys, other small towns that stood in the way of progress. The best they could hope for was a fair relocation package and memories they could pack in boxes. Lily seemed to sense her grandmother's despair because she squeezed her hand tighter. "The river won't let them," she said with such certainty that Ruth almost believed her. "It's been here longer than any of us. It knows how to fight." Ruth pulled her granddaughter close, wishing she could preserve that innocent faith, that belief that love and determination could stop bulldozers and federal permits. Tomorrow, the head of Apex Energy would arrive for what they called a community dialogue session. Tomorrow, they would meet the man who held their fate in his manicured hands. Alistair Finch stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, watching the sunrise reflect off the glass towers that surrounded him like disciples around a prophet. At 48, he had everything the American dream promised: a fortune worth $2 billion, a company that spanned 17 states, and the power to reshape landscapes with a signature. Yet, as he adjusted his Italian silk tie, preparing for the flight to West Virginia, he felt the familiar hollowness that had been his companion for 30 years. Success, he had learned, was the best revenge against poverty, but it was also the loneliest victory. His phone buzzed with messages from his team already on site in Millbrook. "Minor local resistance, nothing we haven't handled before," read the text from his project manager. Alistair didn't respond. These small towns were all the same, clinging to the past while the future rushed toward them like a freight train. The corporate jet touched down at the small regional airport 90 minutes later, and Alistair climbed into the waiting black SUV without acknowledging the driver. The route to Millbrook took them through winding mountain roads that grew narrower with each mile, civilization peeling away like old paint. These mountains reminded him of something he'd buried deep: memories of another valley, another river, another life. He'd grown up in a place not unlike Millbrook, in the coal country of Pennsylvania, where the creek behind their trailer had run orange with mine runoff. His father had drunk himself to death by the time Alistair was 15, and his mother had worked 3 jobs to keep them fed. The day he'd received his scholarship to Princeton, he'd stood by that poisoned creek and sworn he'd never be weak again. Never be at the mercy of circumstances. He would be the one making circumstances. The community dialogue session was held in the Millbrook Community Center, a building that had served as a gymnasium, storm shelter, and wedding venue for 60 years. Alistair entered with his team of lawyers and engineers, their presence filling the room like smoke. The townspeople sat in rows of metal folding chairs, their faces ranging from defiant to defeated. He'd given this presentation 47 times in 47 different towns. The slides showing economic benefits, the promises of job creation during construction, the compensation packages that were always just enough to avoid lawsuits, but never enough to truly compensate for what was lost. He spoke with practiced precision, his voice carrying the authority of inevitability. "Progress requires sacrifice," he said, clicking through images of other successful dam projects. "Your sacrifice will power homes for millions, create clean energy for future generations." An old woman stood up in the 3rd row, her back straight, despite her obvious age. Alistair recognized her from the files: Ruth Thompson, unofficial town matriarch, guardian of one, Lily Mae Thompson. "Mr. Finch," Ruth said, her voice cutting through his presentation like a blade through silk. "Have you ever loved something that couldn't be measured in dollars? Have you ever had something that mattered more than progress?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Alistair's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I understand your emotional attachment to this place, but emotions don't keep the lights on in hospitals. They don't power schools or homes." Ruth shook her head slowly. "No, sir, they don't. But they're what make those places worth powering." After the meeting, Alistair stood outside, smoking a cigarette he'd supposedly quit 5 years ago. His project manager, Davidson, approached with his tablet. "The permits are all approved, sir. We can start preliminary work next Monday. The town has 60 days to relocate." Alistair nodded, flicking ash onto the gravel parking lot. That's when he saw her. The little girl from the files, Lily Mae Thompson. She was sitting by the river's edge, about 50 yards away, her small form barely visible in the fading light. She wasn't playing or throwing stones like normal children. She was simply sitting, her hand resting on the water's surface as if comforting a friend. Something about the scene nagged at him, like a splinter working its way under his skin. That night in his hotel room in the nearest city, Alistair couldn't sleep. He stood at the window, looking out at the lights, but his mind kept returning to that little girl by the river and the old woman's question. He pulled out his laptop and opened the project files, scrolling through the impact studies and profit projections. The numbers were perfect, the logic flawless. This dam would generate enough clean energy to power 50,000 homes. It was progress, pure and simple. Yet why did he feel like he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't quite see, something that threatened everything he'd built himself to be? Tomorrow was Sunday. The demolition was scheduled to begin Monday morning. Sunday arrived wearing a shroud of grey clouds that pressed down on Millbrook like a heavy hand. The town had taken on the quality of a wake. Quiet conversations in doorways, families loading pickup trucks with 3 generations of belongings, the elementary school already boarded up. The resistance had crumbled not with a bang, but with a whisper, the way small towns always died when faced with the machinery of corporate America. Alistair had arrived early, wanting to oversee the final preparations personally. It wasn't necessary, his team was highly competent, but something compelled him to witness this particular transformation. He parked his rental car on the hill overlooking the valley, watching his construction crews position equipment like chess pieces on a board. The demolition was set for dawn Monday, but the evacuation had to be complete by sunset Sunday. Sheriff Bradley, a local man who'd clearly struggled with his role in this, went door to door with the final notices. Most families had already left, their homes standing empty with doors ajar, like bodies that had exhaled their last breath. The few holdouts were given one final warning: leave now or be forcibly removed. Alistair watched it all from his elevated position, feeling like a general observing a bloodless conquest. This was business, he reminded himself, calculated, necessary, profitable business. Around noon, he noticed unusual movement by the river. The remaining townspeople were gathering, maybe 30 or 40 souls who hadn't yet left. They stood in a line along the riverbank, holding hands, their faces turned not toward the machines, but toward the water. It wasn't a protest. There were no signs, no chants, no media. It looked more like a farewell. Alistair found himself walking down the hill, drawn by curiosity and something else he couldn't name. As he approached, he could hear them singing, an old hymn he vaguely remembered from his childhood, something about gathering at the river. Ruth Thompson stood at the center of the line, and beside her, little Lily May. The singing stopped when Alistair got close enough for them to notice him. The silence that followed wasn't hostile, just heavy with the weight of ending things. "We're not here to cause trouble, Mr. Finch," Ruth said, her voice steady. "We're just saying goodbye. Surely even you can understand that." Alistair said nothing, watching as one by one the people knelt by the water's edge. Some whispered prayers, others simply touched the water with their fingertips like a benediction. Lily May was the last to kneel. She cupped water in her small hands and held it up to the grey sky, letting it run through her fingers back into the river. "I'll remember you," she whispered to the current. "I promise. I'll remember everything." The crowd began to disperse, walking back toward their packed vehicles with the slow, measured steps of pallbearers. Ruth took Lily's hand, preparing to leave, but the little girl pulled away. She walked directly to Alistair, looking up at him with those storm cloud eyes that seemed to see through his expensive suit to something underneath. "Mister," she said, her voice clear as spring water, "the river wants to know why you're so sad." Alistair felt something shift in his chest, like tectonic plates grinding against each other. "I'm not sad," he said automatically, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. Lily tilted her head, studying him the way she might study a hurt bird. "The river says you are. It says you've been sad for a really long time. It says you forgot what it feels like to be held." Before Alistair could respond, Ruth had gently pulled Lily away, apologizing for the intrusion. They walked to their old station wagon, loaded with everything they could carry from a lifetime in this valley. Alistair stood frozen, watching them drive away, the little girl's face visible in the rear window until they disappeared around the bend. His project manager approached, tablet in hand. "Sir, we're ahead of schedule. Would you like to move the demolition to this evening instead of waiting for dawn?" Alistair heard himself say yes, though his voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else. As the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of amber and rust. The machines roared to life. Alistair stood at his observation point, watching the systematic destruction begin at the upstream dam site. But then, something unexpected happened. Through his binoculars, he saw a small figure running toward the river, having somehow returned without anyone noticing. It was Lily May, her dark hair streaming behind her as she ran with the desperate urgency of a child trying to save something precious. She reached the river's edge just as the excavators began tearing into the bank upstream, and what she did next would haunt Alistair Finch for the rest of his life. Lily May didn't hesitate at the water's edge. With the solemnity of an ancient ritual, she waded into the whispering river, the cold water swirling around her ankles, then her knees, then her waist. The construction crews, suddenly aware of the child in the water, began shouting, their machines grinding to a halt. Through the drone's camera feed on his tablet, Alistair watched in mounting horror as the little girl positioned herself in the middle of the current, facing the massive excavators that loomed like metal giants on the bank. Then, in a gesture that would crack open the fortified vault of his heart, she spread her thin arms as wide as they would go and wrapped them around herself, as if trying to embrace the entire river. "Stop everything! There's a child in the water!" Davidson screamed into his radio. Men scrambled down the banks, but Lily stood firm, the water rushing around her small body. She closed her eyes and spoke to the river, her voice somehow carrying over the dying rumble of machinery and the shouts of men. "Don't be scared, I'm here. I'll take care of you. Even if they take you away, I'll keep you safe inside me. I promise." She held that embrace, trembling with cold and effort, trying to hold something that couldn't be held, trying to protect something infinitely larger than herself, with nothing but the fierce love of a 7-year-old heart. Alistair dropped his tablet, the image of that small figure embracing an entire river, searing itself into his retinas. In that moment, time seemed to fold in on itself, and he was 8 years old again, standing by that poisoned creek in Pennsylvania, watching his father throw empty bottles into the dead water. He remembered the boy he'd been, the boy who had whispered to that murdered stream, promising that someday he'd be strong enough to fix things, to save something, to matter. That boy had believed the world could be healed with love and determination. That boy had died the day his father had, replaced by someone who believed only in control, profit, and the safety of never caring about anything that could be taken away. But here was this child, doing what he never could, standing in defiance not with weapons or lawyers or money, but with an act of love so pure and futile and beautiful that it shattered every defense he'd built. She was trying to hug a river. She was trying to physically hold on to something that was already lost. And in that impossible gesture, Alistair saw the truth of his entire life reflected back at him. He had become the poisoned creek. He had become the very thing that killed what that little boy had loved. His legs moved before his mind could stop them, running down the hill with an urgency he hadn't felt in decades. By the time Alistair reached the riverbank, Sheriff Bradley had waded in and was gently lifting Lily from the water. She wasn't fighting, she was sobbing, her small body shaking with the force of her grief. "I couldn't hold it all," she cried into the sheriff's shoulder. "I tried, but it's too big. I couldn't save it." Ruth was there, having followed her granddaughter back, and she took the shivering child into her arms, wrapping her in a blanket. She looked at Alistair with eyes that held no anger, only an infinite sadness. "She loves this river the way you must have loved something once, Mr. Finch. Before you decided love was too dangerous." Alistair stood at the water's edge, his Italian leather shoes soaking in the mud, watching Ruth carry Lily to their car. The construction crews stood frozen, waiting for orders. Davidson approached cautiously. "Sir, should we resume?" Alistair couldn't speak. His throat had closed around something hot and sharp. A tear, the first in 30 years, escaped down his cheek, followed by another, then another. The millionaire who had conquered valleys and redirected rivers, who had built an empire on the grave of his own heart, fell to his knees in the mud and wept. He wept for the poisoned creek of his childhood, for the father who had died broken, for the mother who had worked herself to death, for the boy who had believed in saving things. He wept for 30 years of hollowness, for every small town he'd erased, for every river he'd dammed. But mostly, he wept for a little girl who had shown him that the opposite of poverty wasn't wealth. It was connection, and he had been the poorest man in America. Through his tears, he saw the whispering river still flowing, carrying the sunset light like golden thread through the valley. It would be so easy to destroy it, to complete the project, to return to his penthouse and his emptiness. But that little girl's embrace, that impossible attempt to hold a river, had broken the dam inside him. "Stop the project," he said, his voice hoarse. "All of it. Permanently." Davidson stared at him in shock, but Alistair was already walking away, pulling out his phone, calling his lawyers. There would be penalties, lawsuits, a shareholders' revolt. He didn't care. Lily Mae Thompson, 7 years old, had done what no activist, politician, or environmentalist had managed. She had hugged a river, and in doing so, had taught a billionaire that some things were too precious to be measured, too sacred to be sold, too important to be lost. The whispering river would flow free, carrying its stories and secrets through the valley for generations to come. And somewhere in Manhattan, in a penthouse that had never felt emptier, Alistair Finch would spend his remaining years learning how to embrace things that couldn't be held, starting with the memory of a little boy who had once believed the world could be healed with love.